Hello and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where we shine a light onto hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Tom Wright. This week I'm speaking to Stephanie Baker, a longtime investigative reporter at Bloomberg and the author of Punishing Putin, a new book going behind the scenes of the shadow economic war being executed by the West against Russia. So Stephanie, thanks so much for coming on Whale Hunting.
Great to be here.
I loved your book, Punishing Putin. One thing I really love about books like this is you're watching the news, and in this case, it's about the attempts to punish Putin for the war in Ukraine using economic sanctions. And you don't really ever understand where you're at. You can read, obviously, your great coverage in Bloomberg, but it's all so piecemeal, and you don't get a sense of the overarching story. So since the invasion of Ukraine, almost, 3 years ago now, there's been this worldwide attempt by Western democracies, let's call them, to punish Putin and to try to influence the war in Ukraine using economic measures. It led to $300 billion of Russian state assets, finances being seized, and $60 billion in private assets. That sounds like a huge number. Can you start off by telling us whether this has been successful and kind of how it came about?
It's funny you say that, because as I was writing it, one of the biggest challenges was trying to keep up with all the breaking news and kind of see the big picture as it was unfolding. And obviously the success of the sanctions has been patchy at best, and I think that's due to weak enforcement rather than the sort of scale of the sanctions that were rolled out. It has been unprecedented. By some measures, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world, close to 20,000 designations now, perhaps even slightly more, across the sanctions coalition of the US, Europe, UK, Australia. And I mean, in other respects, countries like Iran are far more cut off from the global economy. I think that the US, Europe, and UK were caught somewhat unprepared for the scale of the invasion that unfolded. Of course, there was US intelligence that was warning about an imminent invasion. But I think when the invasion ended up being on the upper scale of, the worst possible end of expectations, they realized that they hadn't prepared an adequate response. And so were then left grasping, as the invasion unfolded, for a bigger and bigger economic hammer to hit Russia with. And I think there was some misplaced optimism early on that some of the measures they took would bring the Russian economy to its knees and, force Putin to turn back, because this stuff had never been done before on this scale. As you mentioned, the decision to immobilize $300 billion worth of Russia's central bank assets, that had been done with Venezuela and Iran, but the amount of money was small in comparison. And then the sort of rapid rollout of financial sanctions against big Russian banks. But of course, Russia rebounded off the sale of its oil, and oil prices jumped because of the very war that Putin started. And I think that has been the central challenge facing the sanctions coalition, trying to undermine Putin's ability to finance the war, has been oil revenues. And I think in many respects, they did the right things, but there was not the kind of enforcement action that was needed to make them successful.
Let's just focus on that 300 billion of reserves that Russia has built up over time, and keeps in a variety of other currencies, dollars, euros, what have you. And obviously this effort was led by the US, the most powerful economic state in the world, and it has its brand of democracy that it likes to push across the world. And this 300 billion was unprecedented. You talk in the book about this idea of sovereign equality, and that is, barring a war between sovereign nations, countries have to be, under international law, treated equally. And that by seizing this $300 billion of foreign assets that Russia had around the world, that was put to the test, wasn't it? And that's a very interesting part of your book.
Yeah, and I think that was probably the most consequential step that they took. It was a decision that I go into in the book, the sort of fast-paced back and forth between Europe and the U.S. and the U.K. in the first 48 hours of the war to immobilize that pot of money. Russia had, unbeknownst, I think at the time, had really prepared the ground for this by shifting a lot of the assets away from dollars and into euros in what looked like a calculated bet that Europe would be too divided to do anything about those reserves. They managed to get an agreement on immobilizing them, essentially, banning transactions with the Russian central bank, which just, froze those assets in place. Most of that ended up in a gray, apolitical financial institution in Belgium called Euroclear. But since then, there's been a debate about whether or not to go the next step and actually confiscate the money and use it for Ukraine. The U.S. finally got on board. It took them quite a bit of time. The UK's on board, Canada's on board, but Europe remains divided on that. And that's when they came up with this idea to raise a loan backed by the interest payments on that money.
Right. So this is this debate about seize versus freeze. So what the global community has done so far, led by the US, is to seize that $300 billion. And I guess you could make the case, and I think you do make this case in the book, in the conclusion to your book, that if that hadn't happened, that would be $300 billion more that Putin would have to wage this unlawful war against Ukraine, right? So that's a positive for sure. But you could also argue, and you do argue, that you could seize it rather than just freeze it and use that $300 billion and give it to Ukraine. I mean, sounds ridiculous to say $300 billion would be a drop in the ocean for what Ukraine needs to fight the war, but it would be better than Western taxpayers having to pay for this, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, legal scholars are agreed that Russia must pay war reparations to Ukraine. There's no disagreement on that. So this money politically is not going back to Russia until Russia agrees to pay those reparations. So the argument in favor of going that next step and actually seizing them is that, this is money Russia owes Ukraine. Why not just go the next step? Ukraine needs it now. It can't wait, till political change in Moscow, enables some sort of deal on war reparations, if that ever happens. But I think there's concern that it violates the concept of sovereign immunity that nation states have. Now, I think there's debate, and I go into the back and forth, telling the story through characters, trying to make what is an abstract legal argument interesting by talking about the debates between Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, and various other people who've been trying to pushed him to change his mind on that. It's a test case, really, I think. And, during the reporting of my book, there have been various, threats that were whispered that, if they went ahead and did this, China might pull back on investing in, U.S. treasuries and the like. So it is it's a big amount of money. I think it's inevitable that this is going to happen. And it's going to be a bit like all our decision-making on Ukraine that has been very slow and two steps behind where it really needs to be. There is an argument that Ukraine needs this money now to be able to win the war. This is a matter of keeping Ukraine a viable state. And of course, with the U.S. elections coming up and the potential for a Trump administration, given what Trump and J.D. Vance have said about, undermining support for aid to Ukraine, that could become all the more important.
So you've got this $300 billion in reserves that have been frozen. And then this other prong is this $60 billion in private assets, which were frozen. And the idea there is to strangle Russian wealth, private wealth here. This is the, Putin's pals who've got money in Londongrad or whatever you want to call it, and in Dubai and other places. And then I think the end game there, which has probably been pretty unsuccessful, is that they would turn on Putin and there'd be some kind of like movement to get rid of him. And that obviously hasn't happened. And you explain in the book why. So do you want to get into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were differing opinions on this. I mean, the sanctions were supposed to bring about behavior change, and that really didn't happen. And I think that the sanctions on the Russian elite, the billionaires around Putin, didn't work in part because there were the sanctions on the first wave oligarchs that made their money in the 1990s, and Putin has no love for those characters and kind of has co-opted them and tolerated them. They operate their businesses with the blessing of the Kremlin, and it'd be very they live within fear of having their assets seized. Then there's the second wave of oligarchs who got rich off of their connections to Putin. Many of them knew him from his days in St. Petersburg. They got rich off of state contracts or appointments at state companies, and they owe their wealth to Putin. So if he goes down, they potentially go down as well. So I think the sanctions as a tool for regime change, I mean, that was never the stated goal, let's be clear, but I think it was perhaps the private hope of some people.
Well, otherwise, why do it? I mean, just to be clear here, we're talking about seizing things like yachts that everyone, we've had at whale hunting, we track private jets and yachts and often Russian oligarchs. You start the book with this case of a yacht being seized, and that's a great way to open the story. But yeah, why do that? Why go after all these houses and yachts if it's not to somehow effectuate regime change or to at least hurt the Russian state, right? You don't care about these individuals per se, right?
Right. So I think some of the policymakers thought, well, they went after some of the assets of oligarchs and billionaires that were sanctioned in 2018. So it was about sanctions enforcement. The sanctions don't work unless you actually enforce them. So if you go after evasion cases, that will show to the world that these sanctions actually have teeth. I think there was also thinking that seizing these playthings of the Russian elite would show the Russian people that they were getting ripped off. I mean, it's a lot of what the late Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny's team has done, documenting the corruption and the theft of assets for Putin and his cronies. So that was one level. The other level is the idea was to seize some of these assets and forfeit them for Ukraine. And that has proven to be far more difficult than many thought, particularly with this yacht case that I go into. I think as the sanctions went on, it became clear that imposing sanctions on these major figures was valid and perfectly necessary because they are big players in the Russian economy. And with Putin putting the Russian economy on a war footing, it was a completely valid strategy to impose sanctions on them to make life more difficult. I mean, a lot of them are feeding in either directly or indirectly into the war economy, so that if you want to undermine Putin's ability to keep this going, that's a valid strategy.
Yeah, I think one of the strengths of the book is how close you are to some of those billionaires. There's Mikhail Friedman, who you knew before all of this and had visited him in London a number of times, I believe. You say he was a bit wary of you because of the stories you'd written about him, but that's normal for a journalist, I suppose. And then when he gets sanctioned under this movement, you go and you talk to him, and he's shocked, and and you have quite a long period of the book where you talk about him making his case for why he shouldn't be sanctioned. And then you have the case of people the other side who say, well, anyone who's made money out of Russian business is corrupt in some way because, you have to have used the courts there and probably paid off judges and all kinds of things. And so, but there is a legal definition of who you go after, right? You can't just say, well, this person looks like a crony of Putin. Normally, it's either something like they've helped somebody evade sanctions or something like this, right?
Right. So the EU first sanctioned Michael Friedman, and then the UK followed suit. The UK had to stand up a sanctions regime quite quickly, and it changed its legislation to make it easier to impose sanctions under a so-called urgent procedure, where it didn't have to line up as much sort of justification for doing so. And that enabled the UK to roll out really rapid sanctions against many of these figures. I think that the case against Friedman, he tried to argue that he's a private businessman, that he had not made his money off of the state, and that he should not be punished for the state's actions. He was trying to play a very, delicate balancing act because while he condemned the war at the beginning, he did not come out and condemn Putin and said very little about the war after that. And he was unique in the sense that he had assets in Ukraine. He was born in Lviv, in this western city of Ukraine, but he made all his money in Russia. And I think the argument for sanctioning him, and let's be clear, it took the U.S. quite a while to impose sanctions on him. It was almost a year and a half after the war started that they finally sanctioned him. I think because he was viewed by some as, Western facing. I think that the UK took a slightly more aggressive approach to sanctions under pressure, really, to shut down Londongrad, because the city of London had been used by Russians to move money for so long. There was a real rallying cry to end this finally. I think I go into this in the book, and I tried to be very subtle about what the situation is there, but that he tried to stay in London. They tried to get him for sanctions evasion. The National Crime Agency bungled the raid and ended up having to pay him damages. And he eventually left the UK, returned to Russia, and is sort of living between Russia and the Middle East.
So you're sitting there in London, in our offices, Brazen's offices in London. Is Londongrad over?
Really interesting question. They've frozen about £22 billion worth of assets, which is huge. And I think they've shut down the most visible elements of Russian wealth in London. But my reporting is there's still sanctions evasion going on in London, partly just because of the regulatory environment, and I think it's low level, low key, involving figures that are not well known, and it's partly because it's so easy to set up trusts and companies in London without any checks. But let's face it, they've done a lot, and it's a very different environment than it was. Prior to the full-scale invasion, Russian money was still very welcome. High-profile Russians were using it as their base. So I think there has been a real sea change.
One of the problems with sanctions is there's always a leaky element, right? There's always somewhere else you can go, or some other corrupt person who'll help you. And I guess London on Thames has been replaced by... Moscow on Thames has been replaced by Moscow on the Gulf, right? Dubai.
Yeah, and I kept hearing about that. So I did spend some time reporting in the UAE to try to flesh that out and understand why and what was happening. I think particularly in the first year after the full-scale invasion, there was a flood of Russian money that went into Dubai, in particular real estate in Dubai, with very few checks on the origins of the money. I think it was very much a free-for-all. And then the UAE came under pressure to clean up its act. It was put by a financial watchdog on a so-called gray list, which was a signifier that it needed to step up the fight against money laundering, and it did do some changes. It did become more difficult for Russians to open bank accounts. They imposed some checks on real estate transactions that were in cash. But I think Dubai remains a cryptocurrency hub. And just purely anecdotally, I just kept hearing about Russians transferring money into the UAE through crypto, specifically Tether USDT, because it's pegged to the dollar. So it's a relatively safe way of transferring money. And I think the crypto sanctions evasion patch is something that has grown over the past 2.5 years.
Your colleague, Zeke Fox, who's been on whale hunting, wrote a great book about, I think it started out as a book about Tether and became this number go up, it's called. If you haven't read that, that's a great book about the use of crypto by all kinds of criminal elements. But yeah, so you're saying crypto and Tether in this case was used to evade sanctions and to get money into Dubai, right? Specifically.
Yeah, because there were, I was told, for instance, particularly looking at the real estate market, that anything's possible. So if you're a seller of a mansion and you're willing to accept crypto, then that's an easy deal. You just bypass. It's just a direct transfer. And then, the seller can then convert that crypto into fiat currency. It has become more difficult. I'm not saying it's as easy as it once was, particularly for large amounts of money. But my reporting indicated that, despite all the scandals involving cryptocurrency firms and Justice Department investigations of FTX and the like, that crypto is still alive and kicking in Dubai.
What happened to all those yachts that fled from the south of France and elsewhere and ended up in Dubai? Are they all just parked there and in some long legal process for someone to seize them?
Well, that was another thing I wanted to check out. There were a few yachts that had been reported by the media, in particular one called Madame Goo, and it was still there in Dubai, being serviced by actually a UK company. And it's a safe haven, really, for a lot of these Russian assets that would be potentially seized if they sailed into Western European or U.S. waters. I had so many yacht stories to choose from. I did not include a lot of them in the book because they just didn't fit into the narrative. So there were a lot of yachts that are impounded, essentially, but still need to be maintained. Both the one I go into in the book in the U.S. That is being fought over in a Justice Department forfeiture case, as well as several in the south of France and Spain and Italy that are just, the future is very uncertain and they are costing money. In some cases, I think they've managed to get the purported owners to pay the maintenance costs and to try to work out what will happen later.
Let's talk about the Westerners who enable all of this sanction busting, right? I just got a list here that I wrote down from the book. There's Helena Bonham Carter, the British actress's second cousin. It's a British guy who helped Russians evade sanctions. There's a lawyer called Wise in the States who did the same thing. Various people who help technology. Obviously, Russia still needs U.S. technology, Western technology for its war efforts. And a lot of that dual-use technology military technology has been sanctioned. And there's a number of people in your book who help to get around those. It's shocking. Oh, and the most shocking is this guy. Is it called McGonigal? Was he called the former FBI agent who works for Deripaska? So there's all these people who are willing to sort of, for money, do things, and that's one of the big challenges with sanctions, isn't it? That there's always going to be somebody who's going to be willing to do something for a lot of more money than they normally would get because there's a sanction involved.
Yeah, I think it's probably the most interesting part of the whole economic war, and something that I had been reporting on was just the enablers, the people, the accountants, the lawyers, the art dealers who had worked for many Russians to kind of launder their money or evade sanctions. The Justice Department went after several of them as a sort of warning sign to others, don't do this business. And some of them were really fascinating stories. Several of them were involved in working for a Russian billionaire called Oleg Deripaska, who made his money mostly from aluminum in Russia and was sanctioned in 2018. So the Justice Department had a good 4 years almost before the full-scale invasion to track his activity and try to document how he was trying to evade sanctions and recover.
Right. We should say very quickly that the initial sanctions on him were in response to the illegal invasion of Crimea a decade ago, right?
They were actually in response mostly to Russia's meddling in the 2016 election, but just in general, it was billed as in response to Russia's malign activities around the world. And he was one of 7 tycoons who were sanctioned. And he fought that and failed. He fought that in the courts and lost that case. But he had a number of assets in the U.S., including several mansions and a music studio, remarkably, which I go into in the book, that he tried to sell while he was under sanctions. And that was one of the cases that they used to go after him. With McGonigal, he was a former FBI counterintelligence official, very high-ranking, who, when he retired, started working for Deripaska, actually to dig up dirt. I mean, money, several things, but to dig up dirt on one of Deripaska's rivals, who in Russia. And what I go into in the book is how remarkable it was that he was actually trying to get his rival sanctioned in the U.S., how the sanctions had become part of this inter-oligarch war in the U.S. that, they all hate each other, basically. The Russian tycoons, they're very few. I mean, some of them are friends and they talk to each other, but they've all got bad deals in their history and rivalries, et cetera. But some of them have genuine, real, long-running disputes, and this was one of them, and how sanctions were being used as a sort of weapon in their own internal games in Russia. The second piece, the sort of middlemen, that has been also a really, I think, important front. The U.S. has tried to go after these middlemen who were trading in Western technology as a way of trying to shut that business down. And I do go into one particular case involving 2 guys living in the United States, Russians that had settled in the one was a Russian Ukrainian, settled in the United States. And one of them was trading and buying Western semiconductors and microelectronics, and in direct correspondence with a Russian intelligence officer based in Estonia, which was quite a remarkable case. That case is still ongoing, and they're fighting it. But I do kind of go into this that it's one of the most important fronts in the war because Russia really needs Western technology for its defense industry, and to a degree that we only really fully understand right now. But they've chosen to go after middlemen who are facilitating these deals. And I think there's a limit to how effective that strategy can be because it's kind of like stamping out it's like a whack-a-mole strategy. And as soon as you shut down one, another one crops up, particularly with these shell companies operating in Hong Kong. I actually did subsequent reporting after I finished my book on this, and it's just incredible how easy it is to open up a company in Hong Kong using some phony address that's really nothing there, shut it down, open it up under a slightly new name at a different address. And I think until the U.S. really goes after the companies that are ultimately, these are Western, mostly U.S. companies, semiconductor producers, until they make them really vet their supply chain, I think it's going to be hard to really shut that business down. You're
talking about companies like Texas Instruments that you mentioned in the book, right? Who their components are crucial to guided missiles, tanks, all kinds of things, right?
Yeah, Analog Devices and Texas Instruments are the two companies whose components are most frequently found in Russian missiles recovered in Ukraine.
So why can't under this very aggressive sanctions regime, why can't this be ended? Is it just because these are historical sales, so they're already in the military equipment that's in the Russian field?
So some are historical, but some are recent, and I, the Russian customs data shows the scale of the trade is just enormous, and it's a sort of complex supply chain. Now the companies say we don't do business with Russia, and it's true they're not doing business directly with Russia, but they regard it as an illicit diversion of their products. But I compare this to where banks were 25 years ago vis-a-vis money laundering, that actually banks were suddenly forced through both the U.S. Patriot Act as well as, some big ticket fines on big banks to clean up their act, invest heavily in compliance to ensure that money laundering is not happening in their banks. And of course, we know money laundering is still happening, but they've had to invest massively in this. And I think the only way to change the U.S. semiconductor industry and Russia's ability to get their hands on that technology is to force the same kind of requirements and compliance on those companies to vet their supply chains.
There are companies that are taking these huge financial hits, huge. And so it's not enough for some companies just to say, well, we don't know what we can't really control our supply chain, and then continue to make huge profits, right, by selling these components that end up on a war field, right?
Yeah, no, it's kind of amazing when you juxtapose that. Here are these companies that are indirectly making quite a bit of money by, their products are still getting into Russia and being sold hundreds of millions of dollars, while the companies that were actually in Russia with physical assets or running major businesses inside Russia, many of them got out. Not all of them got out, but many big names got out. And I go into that in my book that, there's both BP, the oil giant, McDonald's, a lot of the consumer giants, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble stayed. These were companies that I remember as a reporter in the 1990s, coming into Russia, investing heavily into getting a slice of this vast new consumer market, and they started building factories. So I think many of those companies perhaps were hoping that the war would blow over quickly and they could just stay. So there's no reason to get out quickly. And I do go into the case of McDonald's, which was hesitant for the first sort of 10 days after the invasion, but did quickly pivot and got out quickly after more than 30 years of being in the country.
Yeah, whereas some companies have stayed, Nestle, Unilever, Philip Morris, and others, right?
Unilever finally just made an agreement to get out after 2.5 years, which was quite interesting.
Right. So where does this all go from now? I mean, the war obviously is rolling on, huge cost to Ukraine and to Russian military as well. What's the end game of it? Is it going to just, are these sanctions at their limit now, or is there more that can happen?
I think that they could really step up the enforcement of sanctions. They don't have any big ticket items to go after. I mean, there's certain banks, for instance, that are not sanctioned that really could be. One I would note is Gazprom Bank, which was left alone in order to facilitate some payments for gas, which is still going on. I mean, they could shut down the remaining gas trade. I mean, Hungary is a big one. They're still they're still accepting oil from Russia. They could really crack down on Russia's oil revenues by blacklisting more of these tankers that are being used to evade this oil price cap that was imposed at the end of 2022. I think there's been reluctance to do that because there's concern that it would cause gasoline prices in the United States to go up. But I think they could move further to try to really squeeze Russia of the revenues, because I think the sanctions are beginning to build up pressure in the Russian economy that you're seeing now. The inflation is really high. Interest rates are really high. Russia is suffering a labor shortage, which is one of the reasons, it looks like it's turning to North Korea for help. I think a lot depends on the outcome of the U.S. election, unfortunately, as to where this goes. After 2.5 years, the sanctions are really beginning to show. There's a lack of capital in Russia. Russia's facing a payment problem, a real payments crisis almost. There's delays in payments from Chinese banks. The cost of borrowing in Chinese yuan has shot up. And that's why you see Putin this week hosting this BRICS summit, the summit of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, this emerging markets club that Putin and China, frankly, have tried to create a sort of alternative to the G7, kind of focused on the global south. They've expanded it to include other countries. And one of the main goals that Putin has for that summit this week is to create a payment platform for BRIC countries, because they are having problems operating by being shut out of the US dollar. So my fear is that they will take the foot off the pedal right when it's about to start working. If Trump gets in, he has said pretty clearly he wants to end the war in a day. J.D. Vance has been even clearer about how he thinks that could happen. It would be basically ceding territory to Russia, declaring a kind of ceasefire and a no-fight zone. And I would imagine, given that Putin does not look like he wants to give up fighting, he's not changed his overall goals of taking all of Ukraine, that deal would include some kind of sanctions relief, or at least limited relief. And I do go into this in the book that because so many of the sanctions were rolled out under presidential executive orders, if he does win the presidency, he would be able to do that. And the only thing that could stop him would be a sort of veto-proof majority in Congress. So the stakes are really high in this election, and Ukraine's future remains in the balance.
Well, it's a fascinating book, Stephanie. Punishing Putin. You should all go out and buy it. It's a primer on this new front of sanctions in the modern world, but it's also a great history. Stephanie lived in Moscow in the 90s, has been going there for years, and it's a great way of getting up to speed on a lot of what's gone on in Russia, economically and politically over the last couple of decades. Thanks for coming on Whale Hunting.
Thanks for having me.
That's all for this week. Thank you to Stephanie for joining us. Punishing Putin is available in all good bookshops. If you're enjoying Whale Hunting, subscribe to our companion newsletter. Subscribing is free, but if you'd like to support us and get access to more of our work, please consider becoming a paid member. You can find out more at whalehunting.projectbrazen.com or by clicking the link in the show notes. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with more. Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean, Claire Urban, and Arnav Binaikia. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, and Charlie Barlow is associate producer. Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.